You are being lied to about stability. You think your paycheck, your savings, your pension, and your mortgage all run on normal rules. They do not. In 2026, the world runs on a different rulebook, and the people who wrote it are betting you will never read it. And here is the part nobody wants to say out loud: the next financial event will not start where you expect. It will not start with some dramatic collapse in your bank app. It will start somewhere your media barely pays attention to, somewhere with a credit rating and a central bank that can move markets with a single press conference. And once it starts, it will drag your cost of living behind it like a chain tied to your ankle. This is not financial advice. This is financial education, and it is going to be blunt. We are going to talk about why the official story about risk and debt is so comforting it becomes dangerous, how interest rates and currency moves can turn a safe situation into a trap, and why the modern economy is built to protect asset owners while ordinary people absorb the losses. We are also going to connect this to what you are already living through in 2026. AI swallowing middle-class jobs, inflation that never fully healed your purchasing power, housing prices that detached from wages, and retirement systems that look fine only if you ignore math. You are going to hear a framework you can actually use, not a horoscope, not vague motivation, mechanisms, timelines, the ugly logic of how capital moves, how governments behave when they run out of political options, and why the word crisis often arrives late, while the suffering arrives early. Let me start with a question that should make you uncomfortable. If a government owes so much it sounds unreal, why does it still borrow? Why does it still get bailed out? Why does the interest rate stay low? And why do markets keep acting calm while regular people feel broke every month? The answer is simple, and it is also the most frightening one. Debt does not live or die on spreadsheets. Debt lives or dies on confidence, and confidence is manufactured by central banks, manufactured by liquidity, manufactured by coordination between the largest institutions in the world. And when that manufacturing stops, the paper begins to behave like paper. So, let's talk about Japan. Not because you care about Japanese politics, because you should care about what Japan can do to global financial plumbing, and what that means for your money, your jobs, and your future in 2026. Japan has a debt mountain that sounds like an economic nightmare. Government debt measured against its economy has been extremely high for years. In plain English, this means Japan has been living on borrowed time, and more importantly, borrowed money. The trap is the same trap every over-leveraged system falls into. When you cannot grow fast enough to pay the bill, you refinance. You issue new debt to pay older debt. You keep rolling the obligation. That works as long as there is always a buyer. In normal times, there is always a buyer because someone wants yield, and someone believes the currency will be stable enough to hold the risk. In normal times, refinancing is boring. In 2026, refinancing is a battlefield. And the battlefield is visible in bond auctions, in secondary market pricing, in how central banks react when investors hesitate. Now, here is where people get distracted. They focus on the number of debt. They do not focus on the payment mechanism. They do not focus on the fact that governments are not households. Governments can create their own currency through their central bank, and they can decide how to handle interest payments, maturity schedules, and the flow of liquidity into the financial system. But even when a government can print, the political reality remains. If you print too aggressively, you get inflation pressure. If you tighten too hard, you break financial conditions. So central banks walk a line, and the line is not designed to protect you. It is designed to protect the system the way a hospital protects a heart transplant while the patient's entire body is on the operating table. And then AI arrives, replacing middle jobs faster than almost anyone predicted. Retail back office roles, some customer support roles, copywriting and basic analysis roles, even parts of software development, where people were told in 2020 that you could just learn to code your way out of the future. In 2026, the assistant software is better than most junior humans, cheaper and faster. You do not get retrained into a ladder. You get rerouted into a smaller wage pool. At the same time, housing costs keep rising or stay elevated, depending on where you live, while wages lag behind. Rent is not a temporary problem for millions. It is a lifestyle, a permanent extraction, an economic tax. And while your monthly costs rise and your career path gets squeezed, the financial system continues to trade highs and optimism, because money is chasing yield and because asset owners have different rules. They can borrow cheaply, they can reposition quickly, they can hedge in markets you do not even know exist. That is why the next bond story matters to you, because when the mechanism changes, it changes how money moves, and when money moves, it changes everything downstream: employment, inflation expectations, currency values, and ultimately your ability to save, pay bills, or plan retirement. But that brings us to the first uncomfortable truth. Debt is not simply what you owe. Debt is also who holds it. Debt can be safe if the primary holder is the central bank, because the central bank is not going to default the way a regular investor might. Debt can be stable if the central bank controls the buying and the interest rate environment. And that leads to the second truth. The interest rate is not a neutral tool. Interest rates are a lever that decides who wins. When Japan kept its interest rate near zero for years, it was effectively borrowing from itself and from a financial ecosystem that was trained to expect cheap money. If you are a government, cheap funding buys you time. If you are a financial institution, cheap funding buys you leverage. If you are an international investor, cheap funding can buy you global upside. Then, when Japan started adjusting rates again, the global ecosystem reacted, and it reacted in ways that looked like coincidence until you track the timeline. Pattern interrupt. Watch the cause and effect with a cold eye. When Japan changes policy, the currency and the bond yield adjust. Those adjustments ripple through carry trades and through hedging costs. Institutions reprice risk fast, and the assets that were priced for stability reprice for volatility. In one major period, when Japan increased rates, U.S. markets fell. Then when Japan did it again, U.S. markets fell more. And when Japan adjusted yet again, the drop was sharper. You do not need to believe in secret plots to see the sequence. Financial systems move like dominoes when you touch the right edge. Here is the micro story you should picture, because this is what it feels like from the ground. Imagine a mid-level analyst in the United States named David, 31 years old, working in a team that was safe until AI automation started trimming reporting tasks. David's job did not disappear in one day. It shrank. Fewer requests, fewer hours, then fewer promotions. He watched his friends leave for tech startups that promised security, while his own skill set got partially automated by tools that cost the company less than one human. He starts living tighter. He postpones upgrades. He keeps his cash in a high-yield account because everyone online said cash is king. But cash yield is not the same as purchasing power. He still sees groceries rise. He still sees insurance renewals creep up. He still sees his rent jump at renewal time. Now, one day his retirement account drops. Not a dramatic crash. A steady, annoying decline that lasts months. He does not panic. He tells himself the market will recover. But recovery is not the same thing as safety, and safety is not the same thing as a guarantee of buying power. And then, in his group chat, someone posts about interest rates abroad. Someone mentions Japan. Someone mentions currency. Most people treat it like trivia. But to the big money, it is not trivia. It is the calendar. It is the mechanism. It is the signal for when capital will rotate and when risk limits will be tightened. And here is where understanding becomes darker. Japan's government debt did not need to behave like Greek-style debt that forces a political default, because Japan had a central bank inside the same system, and because much of the debt was effectively financed domestically. That does not mean there is no risk. It means the risk often shows up differently. It shows up in currency depreciation over long periods, because cheap money and persistent liquidity can push a currency down relative to higher yield alternatives. It shows up in asset bubbles, because global investors chase returns. It shows up in a slow redistribution away from wage earners toward asset holders, because financial assets are where the liquidity goes. Now, you might say, fine, but why would Japan even want to change rates if it risks instability? The official story is always about inflation. The central bank says it sees inflation pressures. It says it wants credibility. It says it wants normalized policy. It says it must prevent a wage price spiral. That is what they say into microphones. But the financial reality is often more mechanical. If a central bank stops buying bonds and stops suppressing yields, yields rise. And if yields rise, some institutions that depended on cheap funding face margin pressure. Margin pressure means sales. Sales mean falling asset prices. Falling asset prices mean revaluation of risk everywhere. You can create turmoil without needing a dramatic bankruptcy. You can create turmoil simply by tightening liquidity just enough to trigger reallocations. Pattern interrupt number 2. Here is a question you should not be able to answer without feeling uneasy. If a currency crisis were genuinely imminent, why would the currency sometimes rise? Why would it strengthen during periods when you are told the country is doomed? People hear debt crisis and assume currency collapse. But markets can do the opposite when the central bank policy changes, when global investors reposition, or when capital flows reverse. So in one scenario, when Japan increased rates, the yen did not behave like helpless paper. It strengthened. That can happen because global investors want the higher yielding currency when the interest rate differential shifts, or because institutions reduce hedges and reprice exposure. And that can look like proof that everything is fine, but it is not proof. It can simply be a symptom of global capital rerouting, and capital rerouting has a cost.
Because the moment you strengthen a currency, you change the return on assets held by investors who borrowed in that currency. You change the cost of servicing foreign obligations. You change how much local currency it takes to buy foreign assets. You change hedging. Currency moves are not side effects. They are the core of the mechanism. Now we connect this to global debt levels and 2026 reality. The world debt load is over $300 trillion.
That number is too big for your brain to simulate. But you can feel it anyway. You feel it in higher interest rate burdens. You feel it in governments cutting services. You feel it in insurance companies adjusting coverage because climate risk is killing underwriting models. You feel it in migration costs because disasters break local economies. And you feel it in the way markets treat high yield as a game for professionals, while your real life treats it as a threat. When interest rate policy changes in a major economy, global yields adjust, and then capital moves across borders in minutes. So, what happens when a major central bank uses coordination rather than isolation? This is the part where you have to stop thinking like a citizen and start thinking like a balance sheet. Large institutions do not just buy assets, they fund themselves. They borrow, they roll maturities, they hedge, they create exposure through derivatives and currency swaps. If the interest rate and currency environment changes, their entire strategy can become unprofitable. In Japan's case, one logic is that long periods of low rates and central bank support allowed global capital to access cheap funding, which could then be used to buy higher yield assets. That creates a bond market pipeline. It also creates a risk pipeline. If the system needs to be reset, the easiest reset is not to explode the whole machine. It is to change the policy lever and let the parts break where they are weakest. Funding-dependent institutions carry trades and investors with limited margin for error. This is where the timeline starts to resemble previous crises. The Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s is often described as an attack and a collapse fueled by currency speculation. That the story is too simplistic. The more detailed story includes the withdrawal of foreign credit, much of it tied to conditions set by banks and interest rate environments abroad. When funding dries up, countries that relied on external capital become fragile quickly. Then comes the early 2000 dot-com era, which was also fueled by cheap funding and liquidity chasing returns. You do not inflate asset prices without easy money. You do not create leverage without borrowed cash. Then comes the global financial crisis in 2008, which was not only about housing. It was about global funding and risk distribution. Again, liquidity and leverage were central, and now, in 2026, the system faces a new problem. AI-driven productivity is real, but its economic distribution is messy. It can raise profits while suppressing wages for many workers. It can automate tasks faster than the labor market can absorb them. That means demand growth can slow even when productivity rises, which keeps inflation and growth dynamics unstable. So central banks face a dilemma. If rates are too high, the economy weakens and defaults rise. If rates are too low, asset prices inflate and inequality grows. Either way, ordinary people pay. Now, let's talk about something you will hear online as a myth. The myth is that if your government debt is owned by your central bank, the risk disappears. Some people treat central bank financing as a free lunch with no consequences. That is not true. Central bank financing can delay default. It can prevent immediate collapse. It can suppress yields. It can stabilize the government financing mechanism. But it does not erase the macro pressures. If the system prints money and deploys it into the global financial system, the currency can weaken. If the currency weakens, import costs rise. If import costs rise, your cost of living rises. If your cost of living rises, your wage needs rise. If wages do not rise enough, purchasing power falls. So, the risk shifts from government default to citizen purchasing power and currency effects. That is why inequality can worsen without any dramatic bankruptcy headline. And here is the second uncomfortable truth, and it ties directly to your life. Even if a government can technically avoid default, it cannot avoid the political consequences of inequality indefinitely. It can only manage them. It can only redistribute costs. When governments manage inequality poorly, citizens respond with anger, misinformation, and political swings. In 2026, you can see it in election cycles and in protests about cost of living. Now, the video you are indirectly asking me to rewrite is basically arguing that Japan is not simply suffering. It is acting within a global coordination. It suggests Japan's bond and interest rate decisions are tied to larger goals, and that Japan can absorb shocks differently than countries that cannot print. Even if you don't buy every claim of intent, you should understand the mechanism. Policy changes affect global funding conditions, which affect asset prices, which affect wealth distribution, which affects your job security and your financial stability. So how does this translate to what you see in markets right now? Markets keep hitting highs while your life feels worse. That disconnect is not accidental. It happens because financial assets are where liquidity goes. If rates are managed in a way that preserves funding for institutions and suppresses risk premiums, asset prices can remain elevated even as wages stagnate and rents climb. Also, if you do not have access to leverage, you cannot benefit from market upside. You cannot buy dips with borrowed money like institutions can. You cannot hedge as cheaply. You cannot survive volatility because your margin for error is smaller. That is why stock market gains can feel like a joke. People are not celebrating when they feel squeezed. They are celebrating because their portfolios are rising. That is a redistribution in real time. Pattern interrupt number 3. Let's get specific about a problem most people ignore: the ability to cut losses. In professional investing, cutting losses is not a moral preference, it is a survival skill. When losses happen, you exit quickly to prevent a manageable mistake from becoming a catastrophic one. But ordinary investors struggle with this because of psychology and because their losses are tied to long-term goals like retirement. If you have $10,000 that you cannot afford to lose, you do not take the same risk as an institution with millions in hedges. Your error tolerance is limited by your life situation. This matters because markets in 2026 are more volatile in bursts. A single policy shift abroad can change currency values and bond yields fast. AI-driven trading can accelerate reactions. Quant models can move markets in sync, and you do not control any of it. If you are wrong, you might need to wait years to recover. Waiting is not passive. Waiting is expensive. It costs you time, opportunity, and inflation-adjusted returns. Now, here is where Japan's interest rate strategy, whether intentional or just coordinated, becomes a global risk signal. If Japan repeatedly increases rates, it can pull funding back. It can tighten liquidity globally. It can increase the cost of capital just as ordinary economies already struggle with debt and insurance and climate disruption. What happens next is the point where your brain should scream danger, because global capital is not loyal. It does not care about your dreams. It cares about risk-adjusted returns. So if global money exits a trade, it exits quickly. When exits happen quickly, assets drop. When assets drop, leveraged positions blow up. When leveraged positions blow up, funding dries up. When funding dries up, the real economy gets hit. Layoffs, reduced hiring, slower consumer spending, and political instability. Now I want to come back to the yen will become worthless idea because it is a convenient fear. But fear is not an analysis. What matters is not whether a currency becomes toilet paper tomorrow. What matters is whether the purchasing power you rely on is eroded over time, and whether your financial obligations become harder to service. Currency collapse is one path. Currency stagnation plus gradual erosion is another. Inflation imported through currency weakness is another. And sometimes, the worst outcome is slow and invisible. In 2026, many people are experiencing a slow outcome. Their nominal income might be stable or even up a bit. Their purchasing power is down. They feel it at the grocery store and at the pharmacy and in insurance bills. That is how a system breaks without breaking dramatically. Now let's talk about something that makes this even darker: retirement. Social Security in the United States faces funding shortfalls, and many countries have already delayed retirement ages. Pension systems are underfunded in multiple regions. Life expectancy increases mean longer payment obligations. Climate disruption increases costs. The math does not care about politics, so when the financial system becomes unstable, retirement becomes the first casualty because it relies on asset returns and stable funding. This is why the stock market disconnect is so dangerous. You can't treat it like a separate universe. Market stability is not the same as economic stability. Asset price stability can coexist with job insecurity and real income decline. And once people realize that their retirement is at risk, they look for alternative promises. They look for passive income dreams. They look for creator economy fantasies. They look for crypto freedom. But in 2026, crypto is not the Wild West. Regulation tightened. Institutions absorbed liquidity. Banks own more crypto than retail investors in many markets, and the returns you hear about often reflect institutional access and technical advantages. So you get this surreal situation. Ordinary people are told they can escape the system through decentralized assets, while the biggest players integrate into the system through regulated channels. Your freedom is constrained by custody, by liquidity, and by market structure. And while you are trying to learn a new asset class, the old asset class is still winning: government debt, corporate debt, and the central bank transmission mechanism. Now, the script you gave me is essentially saying that Japan is part of a coordinated plan to manage global capital flows, using interest rates as a lever.